The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Margaret Thompson's modest kitchen in Cedar Falls, Iowa, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. At 68, Margaret moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to bear invisible burdens. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, the same mug she'd used every morning for the past 43 years. "Lord," she whispered into the steam rising from her cup, "give me strength for what's to come today." Today marked exactly 43 years since her world had shattered. 43 years since her husband, Pastor Daniel Thompson, had been accused of embezzling $30,000 from Grace Community Church. 43 years since their family had been destroyed by lies that had taken root in fertile soil of small-town gossip and suspicion. Margaret walked to the kitchen window and gazed across the street at Grace Community Church, its white steeple pointing toward heaven like an accusing finger. The building looked exactly the same as it had in 1980, when Daniel had stood before, the congregation with tears streaming down his face, proclaiming his innocence to people who had already made up their minds. The church board had been unanimous in their decision. Elder Robert Mitchell, with his stern voice and cold grey eyes, had read the charges aloud during that terrible Sunday morning service. Pastor Daniel Thompson stands accused of stealing church funds over a period of 18 months. The evidence is overwhelming. We have no choice but to remove him from his position and recommend criminal charges. Margaret remembered how Daniel's shoulders had sagged under the weight of those words, how their 12-year-old daughter Sarah had buried her face in Margaret's shoulder, sobbing, how their 15-year-old son Michael had stood up in the pew and shouted, "My father is not a thief," before running from the sanctuary. The criminal trial had been a nightmare. The prosecution had presented bank records showing suspicious deposits into an account bearing Daniel's name. They had produced receipts for expensive items, a new television, jewelry, restaurant meals, all purchased during the time frame of the alleged embezzlement. Daniel's court-appointed lawyer had been young and inexperienced, no match for the county prosecutor who saw an opportunity to make a name for himself by convicting a fallen pastor. Daniel had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. The jury had deliberated for only 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Margaret would never forget the sound Daniel made when the foreman read those words, a broken sob that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He had been sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Margaret had visited him every week, driving, the 2-hour round trip with their children, watching her husband slowly wither away behind those concrete walls. Daniel had aged 10 years in the first 6 months of his incarceration. His thick brown hair had turned grey, his broad shoulders had become stooped, and the light in his green eyes had dimmed to almost nothing. "I keep praying that God will vindicate me," he had told her during one of their visits, his voice hoarse from countless nights of weeping. "I keep believing that the truth will come out, but sometimes, Margaret, I wonder if God has forgotten about us." Margaret had gripped his hands through the metal mesh that separated them. "God hasn't forgotten, Daniel. He sees everything. He knows you're innocent. Somehow, someway, the truth will come to light." But the truth had never come. Daniel had served 4 years of his sentence before being released on parole for good behavior. By then, their children had grown bitter and angry. Michael had dropped out of high school and left Cedar Falls the day he turned 18, cutting off all contact with his parents. Sarah had finished school but had struggled with depression and anxiety, never quite recovering from the trauma of seeing her father publicly humiliated and imprisoned. Daniel had tried to rebuild their lives after his release, but the stigma had followed them everywhere. He couldn't find work in Cedar Falls. No one would hire a convicted embezzler. They had moved to Des Moines, where Daniel had worked a series of low-paying jobs, while Margaret cleaned houses to make ends meet. He had never been the same man. The fire that had once burned in his sermons had been extinguished. His faith, once unshakable, had become fragile and uncertain. Daniel had died 8 years ago from a heart attack at age 62. Margaret was convinced that the stress and heartbreak of his false conviction had contributed to his early death. She had buried him in a simple grave in Des Moines, attended only by herself and Sarah. Michael hadn't even returned for his father's funeral. Now, as Margaret sipped her coffee and stared at the church that had destroyed her family, she felt the familiar weight of grief and anger settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had moved back to Cedar Falls 5 years ago, drawn by some inexplicable need to be near the place where their nightmare had begun. Her friends thought she was crazy, but Margaret felt like God was calling her back for a reason she didn't yet understand. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Margaret walked to the old rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall and lifted the receiver. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. This is Jennifer Walsh from the Cedar Falls Gazette. I'm a reporter, and I'm working on a story about changes happening at Grace Community Church. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about your late husband's time as pastor there." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Over the years, she had been contacted by journalists a handful of times, usually during slow news periods, when they wanted to revisit old scandals. She'd always declined to comment. "I'm sorry, Miss Walsh, but I don't speak to reporters about my husband." "I understand your reluctance, Mrs. Thompson, but this isn't about rehashing old accusations. The church is undergoing major renovations, and there have been some interesting discoveries. I think you might want to hear about this." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of discoveries?" "I'd rather not discuss this over the phone. Could I meet with you in person?" "I'm at the coffee shop on Main Street right now. It would only take a few minutes of your time." Margaret glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was 9:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. She had no other plans for the day except her usual routine of housework and gardening. Something in the reporter's voice suggested this wasn't just another attempt to sensationalize an old story. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Margaret said. She hung up the phone and immediately regretted agreeing to the meeting. What if this reporter was just looking for a new angle on Daniel's story? What if she wanted Margaret to admit that she had always suspected her husband's guilt? The very thought made Margaret's stomach turn. But as she gathered her purse and keys, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a flutter of hope in her chest, so faint she almost didn't recognize it. She paused at her bedroom dresser and picked up the framed photo of Daniel that sat beside her jewelry box. It showed him in his clerical collar, smiling warmly at the camera. It had been taken just 6 months before the accusations began. "Daniel," she whispered to the photograph, "if there's any chance that the truth might finally come out, give me the courage to face whatever this reporter has to tell me." She kissed her fingertips and pressed them to Daniel's face in the photo, then headed for the door. The walk to Main Street took Margaret through the heart of Cedar Falls, past houses where people who had once been their friends lived, people who had believed the worst about Daniel without question. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 blocks over, was watering her roses in the front yard. She had been in Daniel's congregation for 15 years, but when she saw Margaret approaching, she quickly turned and went inside her house. Margaret had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years. Even now, decades later, many people in Cedar Falls still viewed her as the wife of that disgraced pastor who had stolen from God's house. The fact that Daniel was dead didn't seem to diminish their judgment. The coffee shop on Main Street was a new addition to Cedar Falls since Margaret's return. It occupied the space that had once housed Peterson's hardware store, where Daniel used to buy supplies for church maintenance projects. Margaret pushed through the glass door and immediately spotted a young woman with auburn hair sitting at a corner table, laptop open in front of her. "Mrs. Thompson?" The woman stood and extended her hand. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. Thank you so much for coming." Jennifer appeared to be in her early 30s, with kind blue eyes and a professional but approachable demeanor. She wore a simple navy blazer over jeans and had the slightly harried look of someone who worked irregular hours, chasing stories. "Can I buy you coffee? A pastry?" Jennifer asked as they settled into their seats. "Just coffee black," Margaret replied, still uncertain why she had agreed to this meeting. When Jennifer returned with their drinks, she opened her laptop and pulled out a digital recorder. "Do you mind if I record our conversation? It helps me make sure I quote you accurately." Margaret nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. As she lifted her coffee cup, "Mrs. Thompson, I want to start by saying that I've done extensive research into your husband's case over the past few months. I've read all the court transcripts, police reports, and newspaper coverage from 1980. I've also interviewed several people who were involved in the investigation and trial." Margaret's stomach tightened. "And what conclusion have you reached?" "Miss Walsh," Jennifer leaned forward slightly, "I think your husband was innocent." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. After 43 years of carrying the burden of other people's certainty about Daniel's guilt, hearing someone else express belief in his innocence was almost overwhelming. Margaret felt tears springing to her eyes. What makes you think that?" she managed to ask. "Several things. First, the financial evidence always bothered me. The bank account where the stolen money allegedly went was opened using Daniel's social security number, but the signature on the bank documents doesn't match any other samples of his handwriting that I've been able to find. Second, the timeline of the purchases made with the stolen money doesn't align with Daniel's known whereabouts on several key dates." Jennifer pulled up a file on her laptop. "But what really convinced me was discovering that Elder Robert Mitchell, who led the charge against your husband, had his own financial troubles in 1980. He was heavily in debt and facing bankruptcy. Yet somehow, his financial situation improved dramatically in the months following Daniel's conviction." Margaret's heart was racing. "Are you saying that Robert Mitchell framed my husband?" "I'm saying the evidence points in that direction. But here's why I called you today, Mrs. Thompson. Grace Community Church is undergoing major renovations right now. They're updating the electrical system and have been removing sections of the interior walls. Yesterday, the construction crew made a discovery that I think you need to know about." Jennifer reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. "The crew found this hidden inside a wall cavity in what used to be the church office. The same office that Robert Mitchell used when he served as head elder." She opened the envelope and carefully removed a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be a small notebook and some papers. Margaret could see that the items were yellowed with age. "The construction crew turned these over to the police, and I have a contact in the department who shared some details with me off the record. Mrs. Thompson, this notebook contains Robert Mitchell's handwriting, and it appears to document the entire scheme to frame your husband." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Oh my God," she whispered. "There's more," Jennifer continued gently. "The papers include a practice sheet where Mitchell appears to have been forging your husband's signature. There's also what looks like a partial confession written in Mitchell's hand, explaining how he stole the money and set up the false bank account." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now. After 4 decades of shame and heartbreak, the truth was finally coming to light. But Daniel wasn't here to see his name cleared. He had died believing that some people would always think he was guilty. "Mrs. Thompson, I know this is overwhelming," Jennifer said softly. "But I wanted you to hear about this from me before the story breaks publicly. The police are treating this as new evidence in a closed case. There's going to be a lot of media attention." Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "Robert Mitchell is dead, isn't he? He died about 10 years ago. Yes, he is, but that doesn't mean justice can't be served. Your husband's conviction can be posthumously overturned. His name can be officially cleared, and there may be financial restitution available to your family." Margaret nodded, trying to process everything she was hearing. "How did you get involved in this story, Miss Walsh? Why did you decide to investigate my husband's case?" Jennifer smiled sadly. "My grandfather was a pastor who was falsely accused of misconduct in the 1960s. He was eventually vindicated, but the damage to his reputation and his family was severe. I've always been drawn to stories about injustice within religious communities. When I heard about the discoveries at Grace Community Church, I knew I had to dig deeper." They sat in silence for a moment, both women lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Margaret spoke. "What happens now?" "Well, first, the police will complete their investigation of the newly discovered evidence. Then the prosecutor's office will likely recommend that Daniel's conviction be vacated. There will probably be a formal hearing where the court officially clears his name." Margaret felt a surge of emotion. Grief for Daniel, who had died without seeing this day, mixed with relief. And vindication. He always said the truth would come out eventually. He said God would make sure of it. "It sounds like your husband was a man of great faith." "He was," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "Even after everything that happened to him, even when his own congregation turned against him, he never stopped believing in God's justice. It just took longer than we expected." Jennifer closed her laptop and gathered her papers. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be covering this story as it develops. Would you be willing to speak with me again? I think it's important that people understand what your family went through and how wrong everyone was about your husband." Margaret considered the question. For 43 years, she had avoided talking to reporters, afraid that they would only add to the humiliation her family had endured. But now, with the truth finally emerging, perhaps it was time to tell Daniel's side of the story. "Yes," she said finally. "I think Daniel would want people to know what really happened. He would want other innocent people to know that the truth does come out, even when it takes decades." As Margaret walked home from the coffee shop, she felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of shame and uncertainty that she had carried for so long was beginning to lift. She thought about Daniel and how he had maintained his innocence even when it seemed hopeless. She thought about their children who had grown up believing their father was a criminal. When she reached her house, Margaret went straight to her bedroom and picked up Daniel's photograph again. This time she was smiling through her tears. "You were right, my love," she whispered. "God didn't forget about us. The truth is finally coming out just like you always said it would." She thought about calling Sarah to tell her the news, but decided to wait until the police investigation was complete. There would be time enough for reunions and healing once Daniel's name was officially cleared. For now, Margaret was content to sit in her kitchen, drinking coffee and looking out at Grace Community Church with new eyes. Tomorrow, she would return to Jennifer Walsh and tell her everything about the man Robert Mitchell had destroyed, the loving husband, devoted father, and faithful pastor who had never lost his faith in God's ultimate justice. Detective Ray Castellanos had been with the Cedar Falls Police Department for 22 years, but he had never encountered anything quite like the evidence discovered in the walls of Grace Community Church. As he sat in his cluttered office, on Wednesday morning, carefully examining the notebook and papers found by the construction crew, he felt a growing sense of unease about a case that had been closed for decades. Ray had been a rookie patrolman in 1980 when Pastor Daniel Thompson was arrested and charged with embezzlement. He remembered the case well because it had shocked the entire community. Cedar Falls was a small city where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the idea that their beloved pastor could be a thief had sent shockwaves through the religious community. The evidence against Thompson had seemed solid at the time. The bank records were clear, the purchases were documented, and Elder Robert Mitchell had presented a compelling case for the pastor's guilt. Ray had been too junior to be involved in the investigation, But he had watched from the sidelines as his more experienced colleagues built what appeared to be an airtight case. Now, looking at Mitchell's notebook through the lens of 4 decades of investigative experience, Ray could see things that the original investigators had missed. The handwriting analysis alone was damning. Not only did Mitchell appear to have practiced forging Thompson's signature, but he had also detailed his methods for framing the pasta. Ray opened the notebook to a page he had marked with a yellow, sticky note. In Mitchell's careful script, the entry read, "DT suspects something about the missing funds. Need to redirect suspicion before he digs deeper. The bank account is ready. Used his SSN from the church employment records. Practice signatures look good enough to fool a casual examination." The next entry, dated 3 days later, was even more damning. "Told Thompson I wanted to discuss financial irregularities with him privately. He agreed to meet after Wednesday service. This is my chance to plant the forged receipts in his office desk while he's in the sanctuary. God forgive me, but I need that money more than the church does." Ray shook his head in disgust. Robert Mitchell had been a pillar of the community, a successful businessman who had served on the church board for over a decade. Everyone had trusted him implicitly. The idea that he could orchestrate such an elaborate scheme to frame an innocent man was almost beyond comprehension. The detective's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Chief Patricia Hawkins, his boss and longtime friend. "Ray, can you come to my office? I just got off the phone with the county prosecutor. They want to discuss the Thompson case." Ray gathered the evidence files and walked down the hall to the chief's office. Patricia Hawkins was a tough, no-nonsense leader who had worked her way up through the ranks during an era when female police officers faced significant discrimination. She had been a detective sergeant in 1980 and had actually worked on the Thompson case. "Sit down, Ray," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I've been reviewing my old case notes from the Thompson investigation, and I have to tell you, I'm feeling sick about what we missed." Ray settled into his chair. "The evidence against Mitchell is pretty overwhelming, Chief. How did we not see this at the time?" Patricia sighed heavily. "Because Mitchell was smart, and he knew exactly how to manipulate the system. Look at this." She pulled out a file folder and removed several documents. "These are the original bank records from 1980. See how the account was opened just 2 weeks before the first suspicious deposits began? And look at the address listed for the account holder." Ray examined the papers. The address was a post office box, not Thompson's home address. Why didn't that raise red flags? Mitchell told us that Thompson had opened the P.O. box to hide his illegal activity from his wife. At the time, it seemed to make sense. We were looking at what appeared to be clear evidence of guilt, so we interpreted everything through that lens. Patricia pulled out another document. "But here's what really bothers me. This is the search warrant for Thompson's home and office. Look at who suggested the specific locations where we should look for evidence." Ray scanned the warrant application. Robert Mitchell's name appeared multiple times as a source of information about where stolen money might be hidden. Mitchell directed the entire search. Exactly. And we found evidence in every location he suggested. Forged receipts in Thompson's desk, unexplained cash in his home office, expensive items that supposedly came from church funds. Mitchell had planted everything perfectly. Ray felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Chief, an innocent man went to prison because we trusted the wrong person." "It gets worse," Patricia said grimly. "I've been thinking about Mitchell's behavior during the investigation. He was always the first to volunteer information, always eager to help us build the case against Thompson. At the time, I thought he was just a concerned church member doing his civic duty. Now I realize he was manipulating us every step of the way." The intercom on Patricia's desk buzzed. "Chief, County Prosecutor Stevens is here to see you." "Send him in," Patricia replied. District Attorney Mark Stevens entered the office, followed by Assistant Prosecutor Lisa Chen. Stevens was in his early 60s, a veteran prosecutor who had handled hundreds of criminal cases during his career. Chen was younger, probably in her 30s, with the sharp, focused demeanor of someone who specialized in complex financial crimes. "Patricia, Detective Castellanos," Stevens said, shaking hands with both officers. "I'll get straight to the point. Based on the evidence you've discovered, my office is prepared to move forward with posthumously overturning Daniel Thompson's conviction." Ray felt a surge of relief. "What does that process involve?" Lisa Chen opened her briefcase and pulled out several legal documents. "We'll file a motion with the court to vacate the conviction based on newly discovered evidence. The handwriting analysis of Mitchell's notebook is conclusive. He definitely wrote those entries detailing the frame-up. We've also had forensic accountants review the bank records with modern analytical tools, and they've identified irregularities that weren't apparent in 1980. Stevens nodded. "The case is straightforward from a legal standpoint. The real challenge will be managing the public relations aspect. This is going to be a major story, not just locally, but potentially nationally. A pastor wrongly convicted, spending years in prison, dying before his name could be cleared. It has all the elements that media outlets love." Patricia leaned back in her chair. "What about Thompson's family? Have they been notified?" "That's something we need to discuss," Stevens said. "I understand his widow still lives here in Cedar Falls. There are also 2 adult children who need to be contacted. We want to handle this sensitively." Ray thought about Margaret Thompson, whom he had seen around town occasionally over the years. She had always seemed like a broken woman, carrying herself with the weariness of someone who had endured too much. The idea that she might finally receive vindication for her husband filled him with both hope and sadness. "I think Detective Castellanos should be the one to officially inform Mrs. Thompson," Stevens continued. "Ray, you'll need to walk her through what we've discovered and explain the legal process for clearing her husband's name." Ray nodded. "I'll handle it carefully, sir." Lisa Chen spoke up. "There's another aspect, too. Consider, Mrs. Thompson and her children may be entitled to significant financial compensation. The wrongful conviction, the damage to their reputation, the emotional distress. It all adds up to a substantial civil case against the city and potentially the church." Patricia winced. "How substantial are we talking about?" "Millions, potentially." Wrongful conviction cases often result in large settlements, especially when the injustice was as clear-cut as this one appears to be. Stevens stood up from his chair. "That's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it. Right now, our focus needs to be on correcting the injustice and getting Daniel Thompson's name cleared. Detective, can you visit Mrs. Thompson this afternoon?" "Yes." "Sir, I'll head over there after we finish here." After the prosecutors left, Ray and Patricia sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the case that had haunted their department for decades. "Ray," Patricia finally said, "I want you to know that this investigation is going to be thorough and transparent. We're going to examine every aspect of how we handled the original case, and we're going to acknowledge our mistakes publicly." Ray appreciated his chief's commitment to accountability. "What about the other officers who worked the case? Some of them are still around." "We'll interview everyone who was involved. If there was any misconduct beyond just being fooled by Mitchell, we need to know about it. But from what I can see so far, this was a case of a master manipulator taking advantage of good people who trusted him." Ray gathered his files and prepared to leave for Margaret Thompson's house. As he walked to his car, he thought about the conversation he was about to have with a woman who had spent 43 years defending her husband's innocence, while the rest of the world believed he was guilty. The drive to Margaret's house took only 10 minutes through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. As Ray pulled into her driveway, he saw her working in a small garden beside her front porch. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary, but not unfriendly. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Detective Ray Castellanos with the Cedar Falls Police Department. I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes about some recent developments regarding your late husband's case. Margaret straightened up slowly, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. Are you here because of what they found in the church? Ray was surprised that she already knew about the discovery. Yes, ma'am. How did you hear about it? A reporter named Jennifer Walsh told me yesterday. She said there was evidence that Daniel was innocent. Margaret's voice was steady, but Ray could see the hope and fear warring in her eyes. Mrs. Thompson, would it be all right if we went inside to talk? What I have to tell you is important, and I want to make sure we have privacy. Margaret led him into her modest living room, which was decorated with family photos and religious memorabilia. Ray noticed several pictures of a man he assumed was Daniel Thompson, a kind-faced man with gentle eyes who looked nothing like the criminal he had been portrayed as. They sat across from each other in comfortable chairs, and Ray opened his file folder. Mrs. Thompson, I want to start by saying something that's long overdue. On behalf of the Cedar Falls Police Department, I want to apologize for the injustice that was done to your husband and your family. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she remained composed. Go on, Detective. Ray spent the next hour walking Margaret through the evidence found in the church walls. He showed her photocopies of Mitchell's notebook entries, explained the forensic analysis of the handwriting, and detailed how the original investigation had been manipulated. Robert Mitchell stole that money and framed your husband, Ray concluded. There's no doubt about it. Daniel was completely innocent. Margaret was quiet for a long time after Ray finished his presentation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I knew he was innocent. In my heart, I always knew. But there were times, Detective, when the evidence seemed so overwhelming that even I began to doubt. Those were the darkest moments of my life. Not just believing that Daniel might be guilty, but knowing that my doubt was another betrayal he didn't deserve. Ray felt his throat tighten with emotion. Mrs. Thompson, your husband was a victim of an incredibly sophisticated scheme. The fact that you stood by him through everything shows tremendous faith and courage. He died still believing that someday the truth would come out, Margaret said, tears flowing freely now. He said God's justice might be slow, but it was certain. I just wish he could have lived to see this day. Ray explained the legal process for overturning the conviction and the likelihood of financial compensation. Margaret listened carefully, but seemed more interested in the restoration of Daniel's reputation than in any money she might receive. Detective, there's something I need to tell you, Margaret said when Ray had finished explaining the legal procedures. About 2 weeks before Daniel was arrested, he came home from a church board meeting very upset. He said he had discovered some irregularities in the church finances and was planning to investigate further. Ray leaned forward. Did he mention any specifics? He said the numbers weren't adding up, that money was missing from several different accounts. He was planning to do a complete audit of the church finances. Daniel was very meticulous about record-keeping. It was one of his strengths as a pastor. Did he suspect anyone in particular? Margaret shook her head. He said he didn't want to accuse anyone without proof, but he was definitely concerned. Looking back now, I think Robert Mitchell must have realized that Daniel was getting close to discovering the truth. Ray made notes as Margaret spoke. This information fit perfectly with the timeline established in Mitchell's notebook. The elder had known that Thompson was investigating the missing money, so he had acted quickly to frame the pastor before the real theft could be discovered. Mrs. Thompson, is there anything else you remember from that time period? Any conversations? Any unusual behavior from church members? Anything that seemed odd? Margaret thought for a moment. There was one thing. Robert Mitchell started visiting our house more frequently in the weeks before Daniel's arrest. He said he was concerned about the financial situation at the church and wanted to discuss it with Daniel privately. At the time, I thought he was just being helpful. Now I realize he was probably gathering information to use against my husband." Ray spent another hour with Margaret, gathering details about the original investigation and the impact it had on her family. By the time he left her house, he had a much clearer picture of how Mitchell had orchestrated the frame-up and destroyed an innocent family. As Ray drove back to the police station, he thought about justice and redemption. Daniel Thompson would never see his name cleared, but his widow would finally receive the vindication she had waited for so long. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. The truth was finally coming to light 43 years after it had been buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation. Ray only hoped that Margaret Thompson and her children would be able to find some measure of peace in their father's vindication. Sarah Thompson Martinez sat in her Denver office, staring at her computer screen without really seeing the spreadsheet in front of her. At 55, she was a successful accountant with her own practice, but the phone call she had received from her mother an hour ago had shattered her concentration completely. "Daniel was innocent," Margaret had said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They found evidence in the church walls. Robert Mitchell framed your father." Sarah had asked her mother to repeat the information 3 times before she could fully process what she was hearing. After 4 decades of living with the shame of her father's conviction, the truth was finally emerging. She thought about Daniel, who had died 8 years ago, still bearing the weight of false accusations, and felt a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. Her assistant knocked on the office door. "Sarah, your 2 o'clock appointment is here." "Cancel it," Sarah said without looking up. "Cancel everything for the rest of the week. I need to fly to Iowa." As Sarah booked a flight to Cedar Falls, she thought about her brother Michael. She hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years, but this news would change everything for him too. Michael had always been the angrier of the 2 children, more bitter about what had happened to their family. After their father's conviction, Michael had dropped out of high school and left Cedar Falls as soon as he turned 18. He had spent the next 25 years drifting from job to job, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Sarah found Michael's phone number in her contacts and dialed his cell phone. It rang 4 times before he answered. "Sarah, is everything okay? You never call me." "Michael, where are you right now?" "Seattle. I'm working construction here. Why?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Dad was innocent, Michael. The police found evidence that proves Robert Mitchell framed him." The line was silent for so long that Sarah thought the call had been dropped. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain?" Sarah repeated everything their mother had told her about the evidence found in the church walls. As she spoke, she could hear Michael crying on the other end of the line. 43 years, Michael said when she finished. 43 years I've been angry at the wrong people. I blame Dad sometimes, Sarah. I was so hurt and confused that sometimes I wondered if maybe he really did steal that money." "We all had doubts sometimes," Sarah said gently. "The evidence against him was so convincing, but we should have trusted him more. We should have believed in him." "I need to come home," Michael said. "I need to see Mom and help her through this. And I need to visit Dad's grave and apologize for not believing in him. I'm flying out tomorrow morning. Can you get to Cedar Falls by Friday?" "I'll drive straight through." "Sarah, do you think Mom will forgive me for staying away all these years? Do you think she'll forgive me for not coming to Dad's funeral?" Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes. "Michael, Mom never stopped loving you. She never stopped hoping you'd come home. She's going to be so happy to see you." After hanging up with Michael, Sarah called her husband Carlos to tell him about the developments. Carlos had never met Daniel. He and Sarah had married 15 years ago, long after her father's death. But he had heard the stories and had always believed in Daniel's innocence, based on Sarah's descriptions of him. "This is incredible news, mi amor," Carlos said. "Your father's name will finally be cleared. How are you feeling?" "Overwhelmed," Sarah admitted. "Happy, sad, angry, relieved, everything at once. I keep thinking about all the years Dad spent, believing people thought he was a criminal. He died thinking his reputation would never be restored. But his family always knew the truth," Carlos pointed out. "You, Michael, and your mother never stopped believing in his innocence, even when it was hard. That had to mean something to him." Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon making travel arrangements and thinking about her childhood in Cedar Falls. She remembered the Sunday mornings when her father would practice his sermons while her mother made breakfast, his voice carrying through their small house as he worked out the theology and rhetoric of his weekly message. She remembered helping him prepare communion elements for church services, carefully arranging the grape juice and bread while he explained the significance of the ritual. Most of all, she remembered the day their world had collapsed. She had been sitting in the front pew of Grace Community Church with her mother and brother when Elder Robert Mitchell had stood up to read the charges against their father. Sarah had watched her father's face crumble as the accusations were read aloud, had seen the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of the congregation's shocked silence. The trial had been a nightmare for 12-year-old Sarah. She had attended every day of testimony, watching helplessly as lawyers painted her gentle father as a greedy criminal who had stolen from God's house. The prosecution had been relentless, presenting bank records and receipts that seemed to prove Daniel's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Sarah remembered the moment when the jury foreman had read the guilty verdict. Her father had made a sound, like a wounded animal, and her mother had gripped her hands so tightly that her fingers had gone numb. Michael had jumped up and shouted at the jury, calling them blind and stupid, before being escorted from the courtroom by a bailiff. The years that followed had been a blur of shame and struggle. Their family had been ostracized by the church, community, and Daniel had lost not only his freedom, but his calling as a pastor. Even after his release from prison, he had never been able to find work in ministry again. No church would hire a pastor with a criminal record, regardless of his claims of innocence. Now, as Sarah's plane descended toward the Cedar Falls Regional Airport on Thursday afternoon, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Joy that her father would finally be vindicated, but also deep sadness that he hadn't lived to see this day. She thought about all the conversations they might have had if the truth had come out while he was still alive. Margaret was waiting for Sarah at the airport gate, looking frailer than she had during Sarah's last visit 2 years ago, but with a light in her eyes that Sarah hadn't seen in decades. "My baby girl," Margaret said, wrapping Sarah in a fierce hug. "I can't believe this is really happening." As they drove through Cedar Falls toward Margaret's house, Sarah was struck by how little the town had changed since her childhood. The same tree-lined streets, the same small businesses along Main Street, the same sense of a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Have you heard from Michael?" Margaret asked as they pulled into her driveway. "He's driving through the night. He should be here tomorrow morning." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I've prayed for this day for so long, not just for your father to be vindicated, but for our family to be together again." That evening, Sarah and Margaret sat in the kitchen, where Sarah had eaten countless meals as a child, sharing memories of Daniel and processing the enormity of what they had learned. Margaret showed Sarah the photocopies of Robert Mitchell's notebook that Detective Castellanos had left with her. "Look at this entry," Margaret said, pointing to a page in the notebook. Mitchell wrote, "Thompson is getting too close to the truth. Need to act fast before he exposes everything." "It's dated just 1 week before your father was arrested." Sarah studied the handwriting, feeling a surge of anger at the man who had destroyed her family. "Mom, did you ever suspect Mitchell? Was there anything about him that seemed off?" Margaret considered the question carefully. In hindsight, there were things that should have raised red flags. He was always very interested in the church finances, always volunteering to handle the bookkeeping. And he was the one who insisted that your father should have more access to the church bank accounts, said it would make things more efficient. He was setting Dad up from the beginning, Sarah realized. It appears so, and he was so helpful during the investigation, so eager to provide evidence against your father. At the time, I thought he was just being a good citizen. Now I see he was manipulating everything. They were interrupted by a knock at the front door. Margaret answered it to find Jennifer Walsh, the reporter who had first told her about the discovery at the church. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to update you on some developments in the story." Margaret invited Jennifer inside and introduced her to Sarah. The reporter explained that she had been working with the police and prosecutors to piece together the full scope of Mitchell's scheme. "We've discovered that the embezzlement was much larger than anyone realized in 1980, Jennifer said. "Mitchell stole over $60,000 from the church over a period of 3 years. He was very sophisticated in how he covered his tracks." Sarah shook her head in amazement. "And he pinned it all on my father." "The really tragic part," Jennifer continued, "is that your father was actually getting close to exposing the theft. According to the notebook, Mitchell was panicking because Daniel had started asking questions about financial discrepancies. If Daniel had been allowed to complete his investigation, he would have uncovered the truth himself." Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Daniel always said that God's truth would prevail eventually. He said we just had to be patient and trust in divine justice." "Speaking of justice," Jennifer said, "I wanted to let you know that the prosecutor's office is planning to hold a press conference on Monday to officially announce that they're moving to vacate Daniel's conviction. They want to make sure the community understands that he was completely innocent." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude. After decades of whispered conversations and sideways glances, her father's innocence would be proclaimed publicly for all to hear. "There's something else," Jennifer added. "The current pastor at Grace Community Church, Reverend David Peterson, wants to meet with your family. He's been horrified to learn about what happened to your father, and he wants to discuss how the church can make amends." Margaret and Sarah exchanged glances. Grace Community Church held so many painful memories for their family. The idea of returning there seemed almost impossible. "We'll think about it," Margaret said diplomatically. After Jennifer left, Sarah and Margaret stayed up late into the night, talking about Daniel and sharing memories that had been too painful to discuss for years. Sarah told her mother about the guilt she had carried for sometimes doubting her father's innocence, and Margaret admitted that she too had struggled with doubt during the darkest moments. "But we kept believing," Margaret said as they finally prepared for bed. "Even when it was hard, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming, something deep inside us knew that Daniel was innocent. That was the Holy Spirit, Sarah. That was God, preserving the truth until the right time." The next morning, Sarah was awakened by the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. She looked out her childhood bedroom window and saw a tall, bearded man walking toward the front door. It took her a moment to recognize her brother Michael. He looked older and more weathered than she remembered, but there was something in his posture that reminded her of their father. Sarah raced downstairs and opened the front door, just as Michael was raising his hand to knock. They stared at each other for a moment, and then Michael's composure cracked. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry for staying away, for missing Dad's funeral, for not being here when you and Mom needed me." Sarah pulled her brother into a fierce hug. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Margaret appeared in the doorway, and when she saw Michael, she let out a cry of joy and rushed to embrace her son. The three of them stood in the doorway, holding each other and crying, finally reunited after years of separation and pain. Later that morning, the family visited Daniel's grave in the Des Moines cemetery where Margaret had buried him. It was a simple headstone with Daniel's name, dates of birth and death, and the inscription, "Beloved husband and father." Michael knelt beside the grave and spoke to his father for the first time in over a decade. "Dad, I'm sorry I doubted you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I ran away instead of standing by you and Mom. I know you're with God now, and I know you can finally rest, knowing that everyone will learn the truth about what really happened." Sarah placed a bouquet of white roses on the grave. "We love you, Dad. Your name is going to be cleared, and everyone will know that you were innocent." Margaret knelt beside her children and placed her hand on the headstone. "Daniel, our family is together again, and the truth is finally coming out. God's justice took longer than we hoped, but it never failed. Rest in peace, my darling." As they stood in the cemetery, Sarah felt a sense of closure beginning to take shape. Her father's death had left so many things unresolved, so many words unspoken. But somehow, being here with her mother and brother, knowing that Daniel's innocence would soon be proclaimed to the world, felt like a form of healing. On the drive back to Cedar Falls, Michael surprised them by asking to stop at Grace Community Church. "I need to see it," he said. "I need to see the place where it all started." The church looked exactly the same as it had 43 years ago, except for the construction vehicles and scaffolding around the building where renovation work was in progress. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as they walked up the front steps. She hadn't been inside the building since the day her father was accused. Reverend David Peterson met them at the door. He was a man in his 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that reminded Sarah of her father. "Mrs. Thompson, and you must be Sarah and Michael," he said, shaking hands with each of them. "I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for what happened to your family. What was done to your father was unconscionable." He led them into the sanctuary, which had been partially gutted for renovation. Sarah remembered sitting in these pews as a child, listening to her father preach about love and forgiveness and justice. Now, knowing that Robert Mitchell had sat in these same pews while plotting to destroy an innocent man, the space felt tainted. "The evidence was found in the office area," Reverend Peterson explained, leading them down a hallway. "When the construction crew removed the paneling from the walls, Mitchell's notebook and papers fell out. They had been hidden there for over 4 decades. Michael stared at the exposed wall cavity where the evidence had been discovered. "He hid it right here in the church," he said with disgust. "The same church where Dad preached about truth and integrity. I want you to know," Reverend Peterson said, "that our current church board is committed to making this right. We're planning a special service to honor your father's memory and formally apologize for the injustice he suffered. We also want to establish a scholarship fund in his name for seminary students." Margaret nodded appreciatively. "That's very generous, Reverend Peterson. Daniel would be pleased to know that something positive could come from this terrible situation." As they prepared to leave the church, Sarah noticed that workers were installing a new stained glass window in the sanctuary. The window depicted Jesus with outstretched arms, and beneath it was inscribed the verse from John 8:32, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." "How appropriate," Sarah murmured, pointing out the window to her family. Reverend Peterson followed her gaze. "That window was ordered before we discovered the evidence about your father," he said. "Some might call it a coincidence, but I prefer to think of it as God's providence." That afternoon, the family met with Detective Castellanos and Prosecutor Stevens to review the legal procedures for overturning Daniel's conviction. The process would take several weeks, but Stevens assured them that the outcome was certain. "The evidence is overwhelming," Stevens said. "There's no doubt that your father was innocent and that Robert Mitchell framed him. The court will officially vacate the conviction and will issue a public statement acknowledging the injustice. Sarah asked about the possibility of financial compensation, and Stevens explained that the family would likely be entitled to a substantial settlement for the wrongful conviction and its consequences. "Money can't undo the harm that was done," Sarah said, "but it could help us establish something positive in Dad's memory." That evening, as the family sat together in Margaret's living room, they began making plans for the future. Michael announced that he was moving back to Cedar Falls to help care for their mother. Sarah promised to visit more frequently and to help with any legal proceedings related to their father's vindication. "I keep thinking about what Dad used to say," Michael said. "He always told us that the truth has a way of rising to the surface, even when it's been buried deep. He said we just had to be patient and trust in God's timing." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Your father never lost faith, even during the darkest times. He believed that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. He just didn't know it. It would take 43 years. As Sarah prepared for bed that night in her childhood room, she felt a sense of peace that had been absent from her life for decades. Her father's name would be cleared, her family was reunited, and the truth that had been hidden in the walls of a church had finally been revealed. She thought about the verse on the new stained glass window, "The truth will set you free," and realized that freedom was exactly what her family was experiencing for the first time in over 4 decades. They were free from the shame and doubt that had shadowed their lives, free from the burden of defending an innocent man's reputation, and free to remember Daniel Thompson not as an accused criminal, but as the loving father and faithful pastor he had always been. The truth had indeed set them free, just as her father had always believed it would. Monday morning dawned clear and bright in Cedar Falls, Iowa, as if the heavens themselves were smiling down on the day that would finally bring justice to Daniel Thompson's memory. Margaret Thompson stood before her bedroom mirror, carefully, pinning a small silver cross to the lapel of her navy blue dress, the same cross Daniel had given her on their wedding day 45 years ago. Today, County Prosecutor Mark Stevens would hold a press conference to officially announce that Daniel Thompson's conviction was being vacated and that he had been completely exonerated of all charges. After 43 years of carrying the burden of false accusations, Daniel's name would finally be cleared before the entire community. Sarah and Michael flanked their mother as they walked up the steps of the Cedar Falls courthouse, where dozens of reporters and community members had gathered for the announcement. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also deeply grateful that the truth was finally being proclaimed publicly. Detective Ray Castellanos met them at the courthouse entrance. "Mrs. Thompson, are you ready for this? I know it's going to be emotional." Margaret nodded, gripping Sarah's hand tightly. "I've been ready for this day for 43 years, Detective. Daniel deserves to have his innocence declared for all the world to hear." The press conference was held in the main courtroom, where Daniel's trial had taken place in 1980. Margaret couldn't help but think about the irony. The same room where her husband had been wrongly convicted would now be the site of his vindication. Prosecutor Stevens stepped up to the podium, flanked by Chief Patricia Hawkins and several other law enforcement officials. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to announce one of the most significant developments in the history of our county's justice system. Based on newly discovered evidence, the state of Iowa is moving to vacate the 1980 conviction of Reverend Daniel Thompson on charges of embezzlement." A murmur ran through the crowd of reporters and spectators. Stevens continued, his voice clear and authoritative. "The evidence, discovered during renovation work at Grace Community Church, conclusively proves that Reverend Thompson was innocent of all charges and was the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by Elder Robert Mitchell. Mitchell's own handwritten confession, hidden in the church walls for over 4 decades, details exactly how he stole money from the church and systematically planted evidence to make it appear that Reverend Thompson was guilty. Stevens paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. This case represents a grave miscarriage of justice. An innocent man spent 4 years in prison and lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion for crimes he did not commit. While we cannot bring Reverend Thompson back to life, we can and will clear his name completely. Chief Hawkins stepped forward to address the investigative failures that had allowed Mitchell's scheme to succeed. She spoke candidly about how Mitchell had manipulated the original investigation and acknowledged the department's responsibility for not detecting the frame-up. "We failed Reverend Thompson and his family," Hawkins said bluntly. "Our investigation was thorough by the standards of 1980, but we were deceived by a sophisticated criminal who understood exactly how to manipulate our procedures. We take full responsibility for this failure, and we are committed to ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again." When the officials finished their statements, several reporters raised their hands to ask questions. Jennifer Walsh, who had broken the story, was recognized first. "Prosecutor Stevens, what kind of financial restitution is the Thompson family entitled to for this wrongful conviction?" Stevens glanced toward Margaret and her children before answering. "The family will certainly be entitled to substantial compensation for the injustice they suffered. Wrongful conviction cases typically result in significant settlements, and this case involves not just the conviction itself, but decades of damaged reputation and emotional trauma." Another reporter asked about the church's role in the scandal. Stevens explained that while Grace Community Church, as an institution, had been victimized by Mitchell's embezzlement, the current leadership was cooperating fully with the investigation and had committed to making amends to the Thompson family. After the official statements concluded, Margaret was invited to speak to the media. She approached the podium slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the wooden stand. 43 years ago, my husband Daniel Thompson was accused of crimes he did not commit," Margaret began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "From that day until the day he died 8 years ago, Daniel maintained his innocence. He never wavered in his faith that God would eventually reveal the truth." Margaret paused, looking out at the crowd of faces, some sympathetic, some curious, some ashamed. Many were people who had known Daniel personally, who had attended his church and heard his sermons. "Daniel was not just my husband," she continued. "He was a faithful pastor who devoted his life to serving God and helping others. He was a loving father who taught our children about integrity and truth. He was a man who believed that even in the darkest circumstances, God's justice would ultimately prevail." Her voice began to break with emotion. "Daniel died without seeing his name cleared, but he never stopped believing that this day would come. He used to tell me, 'Margaret, the truth is like a seed buried in the ground. It may stay hidden for a long time, but eventually it will sprout and grow and bloom for all to see.'" Margaret wiped tears from her eyes before continuing. "Today that seed has finally bloomed. The truth has been revealed, and my husband's innocence has been proven beyond any doubt. While I grieve that Daniel is not here to witness his vindication, I know that he is with our Lord in heaven, finally at peace, knowing that justice has been served." She concluded her remarks by thanking the police officers and prosecutors who had worked to uncover the truth, as well as the construction workers whose discovery had made the revelation possible. "Most of all," Margaret said, "I want to thank God for never abandoning us, even when it seemed like the truth would never come to light. As it says in Psalm 37:6, He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, the justice of your cause like the noonday sun." Today, The sun is shining brightly on Daniel Thompson's memory. As Margaret stepped away from the podium, the courthouse erupted in applause. Many people in the audience were crying, moved by her words and by the enormity of the injustice that had finally been corrected. After the press conference, the Thompson family was approached by dozens of community members who wanted to express their support and apologize for doubting Daniel's innocence. Former parishioners who had known Daniel personally spoke about their guilt for believing the accusations against him. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," said elderly Mrs. Patterson, who had been a member of Grace Community Church during Daniel's tenure as pastor. "I should have known that Daniel could never have done what they accused him of. He was the most honest man I ever knew." Similar conversations continued throughout the afternoon as word of Daniel's exoneration spread through Cedar Falls. Many people who had shunned the Thompson family after the conviction now sought them out to make amends. That evening, Reverend Peterson held a special service at Grace Community Church to honor Daniel's memory and formally apologize on behalf of the congregation. The sanctuary was packed with people who wanted to pay their respects to the pastor who had been wronged so terribly. Margaret, Sarah, and Michael sat in the front pew, the same pew where they had sat 43 years ago when Daniel was first accused. But this time, instead of shame and horror, they felt peace and vindication. Reverend Peterson began the service by reading from Isaiah 61, 1-3. "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair." Today, Reverend Peterson said, "we witness the fulfillment of this prophecy in the life of Daniel Thompson. The truth has set him free from false accusations, beauty has risen from the ashes of injustice, and joy has replaced decades of mourning." The service included testimonials from people who had known Daniel personally. They spoke about his kindness, his dedication to his calling, and his unwavering faith even in the face of persecution. Several former parishioners admitted their shame for doubting him and asked Margaret's forgiveness. "Daniel Thompson was more than our pastor," said longtime church member Robert Hayes. "He was our friend, our counselor, and our spiritual guide. We failed him when he needed us most, and we can never undo that failure. But we can honor his memory by learning from our mistakes and committing ourselves to seeking truth and showing grace to those who are accused wrongly." The service concluded with the dedication of a memorial window in Daniel's honor. The window depicted the parable of the mustard seed with the inscription, "Truth, like faith, grows from the smallest beginnings to transform the world." Margaret was invited to unveil the window, and as she pulled away the covering, sunlight streamed through the colorful glass, bathing the sanctuary in brilliant hues. After the service, Margaret stood with her children outside the church, looking up at the steeple that had loomed over their family like a symbol of judgment for so many years. Now it seemed to point toward heaven in celebration rather than condemnation. "Dad would be so proud," Michael said, his arm around his mother's shoulders. "Not just because his name was cleared, but because of how you kept believing in him all these years, Mom. You never gave up on the truth." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Dad always said that faith wasn't about having all the answers, but about trusting God, even when you couldn't see the whole picture. You showed that kind of faith, Mom." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Your father showed that faith too. Even in prison, even when everyone thought he was guilty, he never stopped believing that God would make things right. He just didn't know it would take so long." In the weeks that followed, the Thompson family worked with attorneys to finalize the legal proceedings for Daniel's exoneration and to pursue compensation for the wrongful conviction. The settlement negotiations resulted in a substantial award that would provide financial security for Margaret and allow the family to establish the Daniel Thompson Scholarship Fund for seminary students studying pastoral ministry. The fund's mission statement read, "In memory of Reverend Daniel Thompson, who demonstrated that truth and integrity can survive even the darkest persecution, this scholarship supports future pastors who are committed to serving God with honesty, courage, and unwavering faith." 6 months after Daniel's exoneration, Margaret made the decision to return to regular worship at Grace Community Church for the first time in over 4 decades. Sarah and Michael accompanied her on that first Sunday back, and the congregation welcomed them with overwhelming warmth and gratitude. Margaret chose to sit in the same pew where her family had worshipped when Daniel was pastor. As Reverend Peterson began his sermon on God's justice and mercy, Margaret felt Daniel's presence with her in a way she hadn't experienced since his death. The sermon text was from Romans 8:28. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Reverend Peterson spoke about how even the most terrible injustices could ultimately be used by God to bring about good. How Daniel's suffering had led to renewed attention to the problem of wrongful convictions. How his family's faithfulness had inspired others to persevere through their own trials, and how the discovery of the truth had brought healing and redemption to an entire community. Daniel Thompson's story reminds us that God's justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. Reverend Peterson concluded, "The truth that was hidden in these very walls for over 4 decades has finally been revealed, and with it comes the promise that no injustice is beyond God's power to correct." After the service, Margaret approached the memorial window that had been installed in Daniel's honor. The sunlight streaming through the glass created patterns of color on the floor, and Margaret remembered something Daniel had told her during one of their last conversations before his death. "Margaret," he had said, "I may never see my name cleared in this life, but I know that God sees the truth, and someday, somehow, that truth will shine so brightly that everyone will see it too." Standing before the memorial window, Margaret whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. "You were right, Daniel. The truth is shining brightly now, and everyone can see it. Rest in peace, my love. Justice has finally been served." As Margaret walked out of the church that morning, she felt lighter than she had in decades. The weight of shame and doubt that she had carried for 43 years had finally been lifted. Daniel's innocence had been proven, their family had been reunited, and their faith in God's ultimate justice had been vindicated. The truth that had been hidden in the church walls had not only freed Daniel's memory from false accusations, it had also freed his family from the burden of defending his innocence. They could now remember him not as an accused criminal, but as the faithful pastor, loving husband, and devoted father he had always been. God's justice had indeed prevailed, exactly as Daniel had always believed it would. The seed of truth that had been buried for so long had finally sprouted and bloomed, bringing beauty from ashes and joy from mourning. And in a small church in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the light of truth continued to shine through a memorial window, reminding all who saw it that justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice perfected in God's perfect timing. The Thompson family's long journey through darkness was finally over. The light had broken through at last, illuminating not just Daniel's innocence, but also the power of faith to sustain hope even in the most hopeless circumstances. After 43 years of waiting, truth had triumphed. Love had conquered hatred, and God's justice had been revealed for all the world to see. Margaret Thompson could finally rest in peace, knowing that her husband's name had been cleared and his legacy restored. The man who had been falsely accused in 1980 had been completely vindicated in 2023, and the truth that had been hidden in the church walls would continue to inspire others for generations to come. Justice had been served, faith had been rewarded, and the Thompson family could finally say with confidence, "The truth has set us free."